Good evening. My name is Anna Greenwood-Lee, and I'm the Anglican Bishop of the Anglican Diocese of the Islands and the Inlets here in this part of the world. And the lecture this evening is a collaboration between the Anglican Diocese and the Center, made possible by a very generous gift from John Albert Hall and his estate. And so that's why we're here tonight. And we look forward to continuing the exploration of the themes at the intersection of religion and society that are so close to so many people's hearts. But as we begin tonight, I want to acknowledge and respect that the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory this university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimals, and Wasanic peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. And some of us did a book study of Cynthia's book on resisting structural evil to prepare for this event. And obviously at this point in history, we are becoming increasingly aware of the ways in which we as a church and a society have failed to resist the structural evils of colonialism and racism and have in fact perpetuated them. And I've personally found Cynthia's work extremely helpful in kind of really seeing that. So it's a pleasure to be here with you tonight, and I look forward to Cynthia's talk with us. Paul.
Hi, everybody. Thanks very much, Bishop Anna, for welcoming everyone today. And thanks and welcome everybody on Zoom. I think we had something like 150 Zoom registrants, so welcome, however many of you there are right now. Welcome, Anna, and thank you very much for welcoming people and providing some context for a lecture series that has not only enabled us to bring some world-class scholars to Victoria or virtual Victoria, but has also been a kind of a model of the ways that secular and religious communities might engage one another on issues of common concern. I'm very pleased today to have the role to introduce our speakers for this evening. Dr. Cynthia Moe-Lobeda works as Professor of Theological and Social Ethics at the Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary and Church Divinity School of the Pacific. Before she moved to California, she served on the faculty of Seattle University in its School of Theology and Ministry, Department of Theology, Religious Studies, and Environmental Studies programs. Now, these postings tell you something about the scope of her teaching and research. Her authored or co-authored books include Bible and Ethics, A New Conversation, Resisting Structural Evil, Love as Ecological-Economic Vocation, which Anna just mentioned, Public Church for the Life of the World, Healing a Broken World, Globalization and God, and St. Francis and the Foolishness of God, among others. These scholarly accomplishments are obviously quite impressive, but I should note that they are paired with a long track record of working in the trenches of critical pedagogy, activism, and ecumenism in the Americas, Africa, Asia, and Europe. For example, she serves on a 13-person advisory panel appointed by the World Council of Churches, the Lutheran World Federation, the World Communion of Reformed Churches, and the Council for World Missions. And it's tasked with imagining a new international financial and economic architecture. Questions around justice that emerge in thinking, teaching, and trying to improve the lives of marginalized people are clearly through lines in her work. But of course, one of the most pressing concerns many of us in this room share is the threat posed to our collective futures by climate change. This will be one of the key features of her remarks this evening. Following the lecture and prior to what we are sure will be a robust public conversation with people in the room and people on Zoom, we've asked Dr. David Seljak, one of the CSRS's most thoughtful and remote citizens, to engage her in conversation about their shared interests. David joins us today from St. Jerome's University at the University of Waterloo, where he is Professor of Religious Studies. David's one of Canada's authorities on religion, society, and politics. And we're very fortunate to have him with us here this evening. David's published articles on religion and nationalism in Quebec, religion and human rights, as well as post-secularism in Canada. He and I co-edited Religion and Ethnicity in Canada and Christianity and Ethnicity in Canada, and we're hard at work on our next volume on Indigenous spiritualities and religion in the public arena. David is by instinct a sociologist of religion, and by habit one of the funniest people in the academy. University of Waterloo, for the last 2 decades, he's taught a course, a very large course on evil. The class continues to be popular, even though surely students realize by the end of the first week that they will actually be immersed in a long homily, cri de coeur, sociological deconstruction of systems in our world that produce structural evil that make the infamous personal Satan look like a jaywalker. The fact that they stay suggests that David has a special gift for connecting students with these central human concerns that are really the topic of our discussion tonight. And now, without further delay, I ask you to join me in welcoming Dr. Cynthia Moe-Lobeda.
Thank you, Paul. And thank you, Bishop Anna, for opening us as you did. May we all be deeply present with one another, even across these miles and the waves of cyberspace. It really is a joy for me to be engaged with you, the people who are a part of this Diocese of Islands and Inlets, or are connected with the Center for Studies in Religion and Society. I want to thank everyone from the center and the diocese who have worked so creatively to plan this event. In particular, John Fitanamil and Brendan Nielsen and Scott Dolph and Rachel Brown and Paul Ramadat and Noriko Prezu. You have been amazing. Let us open this time together with gratitude. Gratitude for the creatures and elements that enabled us to awaken this morning and draw our first breath, move our limbs, take in our food, relish the air on our skin, and offer ourselves for the healing of the world. We give great thanks for the trillions of microbes living in and on our bodies, in our tear ducts, in our guts, on our skin. We give thanks for the elements and creatures that give us life, our external lungs, the trees, the thousands of organisms in the soil that grew your breakfast, the pollinators. We give thanks for our ancestors. And we give thanks for the living companions who have been present to us today. Great Spirit, we give you thanks. I would actually like to dedicate my talk this evening, and this actually relates to Bishop Anna's opening comments. I'd like to dedicate my talk to my great-grandparents and my grandparents, whom I loved deeply and who gave me so very much, who were such good people, and at the same time were part of the structural evil that stole this continent from its people. So we begin. Friends here gathered, our moment in time is pivotal. As declared by one of the world's respected climate experts, the next few years are probably the most important in history, end quote. Will you hear this again? The next few years are probably the most important in history. In light of climate change, humankind hovers on a precipice. On one side is our current path leading toward almost unimaginable catastrophe in which the deadly consequences of climate change strike first and foremost on those least responsible for causing it, and in which the gap between those who have too much and those who have not enough continues to widen. On the other side, however, is the potential before us, a world in which all people have the necessities for life with justice and joy, and Earth's ecosystems flourish. Friends, never before has humankind faced the epic choice that we, adults alive today, now face. Never before in human history has the world so needed human beings to claim and use our gifts. The gift of a magnificent brain equipped for solving the most vexing of problems. The gift, as Yuval Harari argues, of widespread collaboration. And the gift of religion, at its best, enabling moral, spiritual power for the widespread good. Therefore, each one of you has a key role to play. What you do matters, and it matters tremendously. To understand that role, we must venture further into painful realities shaping life on Earth today. My lecture begins there. It is a dangerous beginning point, for it may evoke a sense of doom or hopelessness. But please know we will not stay there in this hour. We will move on to the terrain of hope. But actually, first, the title of this lecture begins with resisting structural evil, not with climate change. So I decided to share with you a story from my life regarding structural evil, although I confess I have never begun an academic lecture in this way before. I first became aware of structural or systemic evil when I was about 14. Initially, it was through a film in my church youth group. I learned that much of my food, sugar, chocolate, fruit, vegetables, and more, was produced in ways that were brutally exploitative to other people, especially in Latin America. I was appalled. I was horrified as I learned more and more. The chemicals in our electronics, our clothing, our soda pop, our coffee comes at great price of others' blood and freedom and lands. The Jesuit priest, John Sobrino, who was a leader of the community of priests murdered by paramilitary troops in El Salvador some years ago, nailed it. He was talking with a delegation of North Americans that I was co-leading in that country. He declared, I quote, "In El Salvador, poverty means death, and people are not poor by chance. They are poor because the systems that bring your wealth make them poor," end quote. He is describing one manifestation of structural evil. His words are haunting. They are matched by African-American theologian Peter Perrow, who wrote, "If the church is the body of Christ on earth, then the body of Christ is composed of active thieves, passive profiteers, and innocent victims," end quote. Well, how did I deal with this kind of knowledge as a 14-year-old? I became a passionate activist, but within 2, maybe 3 years, when I began to see the intricacy and the complexity of these economic systems shored up by military interventions and political maneuvering, when I saw how invisible this all was to most people benefiting materially from it, well, I descended into hopelessness and self-degradation. I came to hate people like me, white middle strata North Americans, benefiting from those systems. And ultimately, I came to hate myself. I hated myself for my role in structural evil, though I did not at that time have that term. We could talk about how I made my way from that space into a space of engaged hope, but that is perhaps conversation for later in this hour. As we all know, the last few years of racial reckoning and colonialism reckoning complexify the realities of economic injustice. Today, we realize that it is also racial in nature, that racism and unspoken ideologies of white supremacy, that white people's needs and rights and worth take precedence. These have meant that people of color and indigenous people have suffered disproportionately from economic injustice. These are two forms of systemic evil, economic and racial. They're not new. But a third form is new, climate change and climate injustice. The human species, no, rather the high consuming part of the human species, most of us here gathered, I imagine, has, through climate change, become a threat to life on Earth. The credible scientific community is of one accord about this reality. Less widely accepted, however, is a corollary point of soul-searing moral import. It is this: in general, the people most devastated by climate change are not causing it. The race and class dimensions of this injustice are stark. While caused primarily by high-consuming people, climate change is wreaking death and destruction first and foremost on impoverished people who are also disproportionately people of color. The island nations that will be rendered unlivable by rising seas, subsistence farmers whose crops are lost to climate change, and many coastal people without resources to protect against and recover from the fury of climate-related weather disaster are not the people largely responsible for greenhouse gas emissions, nor are they, for the most part, white. These forms of structural evil would not be such a moral problem if we had no capacity to resist them and rebuild alternatives. But that is not the case. We do have that capacity. Economies are constructed by human decisions and actions, and as such, they can be changed by other human decisions and actions. So too are racist policies and structures, and the lifeways that fuel climate change. All are created by human decisions and actions, and therefore can be changed. So what do we do with this reality? How are we to face systemic evil in which we are all wrapped up and that provides our material goods? How do we face it with hope and with moral spiritual power? I have a strong hunch that tremendous insight and wisdom in response to that question resides in the people gathered in this Zoom gathering. And I wish we had days together to explore that wisdom. Instead, however, I'll share just a piece of what I have learned. It is a framework that I call moral vision. That will be part 2 of these comments. Part 1 was just concluded. A very brief part 3 will look at the particular role of religion. So, on to part 2, moral vision, 4 lenses. Moral vision, as I use that term, is a phrase to signify the union of vision in 4 forms. The first is seeing what is going on in whatever situation is at hand, and especially unmasking structural evil that parades as good. Secondly, seeing what could be, that is, more equitable and ecologically viable alternatives. And third, seeing the astounding beauty that pervades and surrounds our lives. And finally, seeing ever more fully the sacred spirit of life coursing throughout creation and leading it, despite all evidence to the contrary, into abundant life for all. Vision of this 4-fold sort is subversive. It is subversive because In the words of Walter Brueggemann, it keeps the present provisional and refuses to absolutize it, end quote. This kind of vision reveals a future in the making and breeds hope for moving into it. We begin with the first lens. What is? Walter Wink, New Testament theologian Walter Wink writes, "Nothing is more transformative and threatening to the way things are than truly seeing and naming it," end quote. Yes, the first and vitally important task of resistance and rebuilding is daring to see what is going on. Not doing so, for people who are not suffering directly from what is going on, is moral blindness. But moral blindness in the face of structural evil is so much easier than seeing. Why is that? Why is seeing what is going on so hard? How has it been possible for educated, compassionate people to fail to recognize that we are destroying Earth's capacity to sustain life? Or to recognize that people and lands around the world are degraded and sometimes destroyed to meet our insatiable appetite for cheap goods, including fossil fuels? How could settler colonial US people and Canadians fail to see the horrors perpetrated against Indigenous peoples by our systems? How is this possible? Dietrich Bonhoeffer is helpful here. Bonhoeffer, one of the leaders of the faith-based resistance, the church-based resistance to fascism in Germany, while reflecting from prison on the widespread complicity with fascism in Hitler's Germany, provides striking insight into the hiddenness of evil. He writes, "The great masquerade of evil has played havoc on all our ethical concepts. Evil appears disguised as light, charity, historical necessity, or social justice. Its ability to appear disguised, to hide, confirms its wickedness," end quote. That is, the cloaked nature of structural evil is at its very heart. Bonhoeffer's words reveal more. They name 4 masks behind which structural evil hides: light, charity, historical necessity, and social justice. Ah, yes, the boarding schools were cloaked as charity. Pension funds continued investment in fossil fuels hides behind the mask of historical necessity. But light? Yes. Structural evil hides by weaving brutality into the beautiful moments of our lives. The beauty of my flying to see my grandchildren spews forth mountains of greenhouse gases that create the climate change that even now has forced millions into climate migrancy. The work that we do in our universities and our churches is so beautiful. Yet so many of the tools that we use daily, the computers, our clothing, the roofs over our heads, our equipment, are produced and transported by fossil fuels. As noted by Julia Watts-Belser, the beauty is upheld by the brutal. That is, in Bonhoeffer's words, structural evil hides behind the mask of light. Well, seeing cruel realities in which we are implicated, that is the first lens of vision. Seeing what is going on requires courage. seeing in ways that build moral power rather than despair or powerlessness requires wisdom. Courage and wisdom begin with facing truth, the truth about our role in structural evil. Some time ago, I was invited to India to work with seminary leaders on matters of eco-justice. They, church leaders in India, gently encouraged me to re-see climate change as climate colonialism. Climate change, declared one high-level Indian religious leader, I quote, is caused by the colonization of the atmospheric commons by the powerful nations and the powerful within them. However, communities with almost zero carbon footprint bear the brunt of the consequences, end quote. Climate colonialism and climate debt are terms arising from the global south to describe this injustice. It is material and consequential. Consider hunger. One of climate change's most savage impacts on humanity will be increased hunger, notes Oxfam's report, Climate Change versus Food Security. Let it sink in. When food is very scarce, the poorest starve, especially if free market rules govern food prices. The World Bank warns that drought-affected areas will increase to nearly half the global cropland by 2100, with sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia hit hardest. With drought in food-vulnerable areas, death stalks. Rising seas could threaten more than 25% of Africa's people and drown some island states. No less alarming, desertification will strike hard in the Arab world and Southern Africa. It provokes war. The US Department of Defense identifies climate change as a foremost security threat to the US. The impact of climate change in some on the world's already vulnerable people is stunning. Yet the cause of it is the uncontrolled release of greenhouse gases, especially by high-consuming nations like ours. Courageous seeing of structural evil reveals the unbearable. Just by housing, feeding, clothing, and transporting ourselves, we are killing. By doing nothing, we actively bring on the catastrophe. Yes, learning what is really going on, especially uncovering structural evil that is hidden by its intermingling with good, is a tremendously important first step. However, it gives rise to a terrible paradox. To change the situation, we need to see it. But when we begin to get it, when denial or ignorance is overcome and awareness dawns, a disabling kind of rage or a foreboding sense of doom or powerlessness or too lateness may set in, threatening to overpower any sense that we can make a difference. In short, the more one sees, the more powerless one may feel. The knowledge necessary for moral acting may also impede that acting. How then are we to recognize structural evil in ways that build hope and moral power? Experience has taught me that seeing what is, that first lens of moral vision, must be accompanied by a second, a third, and a fourth lens. The second is what could be and is in the making. Structural evil is only part of the story of our day. Our time is also magnificently ripe with potential for dramatic social change toward a world of ecological sanity and social equity. Seeing what could be means attuning ourselves to the vast body of people and groups around the world, here in Canada and around the globe, who are claiming and demonstrating the reality that more just and ecological ways of organizing economies and societies are indeed possible. These groups are composed of farmers, fisher people, scholars, lawyers, homemakers, students, homeless people, religious leaders, scientists, educators, retail workers, and so many more. In one way or another, a multitude are drawing the connections between climate change and advanced global capitalism. To mitigate climate change significantly, they assert, fossil-fueled advanced global capitalism and the ways of life in accord with it are not an option. Now, this is not an ideological statement or a political or moral opinion. It's a statement about physical reality. Earth, as a biophysical system, cannot continue to operate according to the defining features of capitalism as we know it. Capitalism, as it has developed from classical economic theory through neoclassical theory and on to neoliberalism, depends on or aims at what Earth can no longer provide or provide for. 1, unlimited growth. 2, unlimited services like climate regulation provided by the Earth. 3rd, unlimited resources like water and soil provided by the Earth. 4, Earth cannot sustain, these are the items that Earth cannot sustain. 4, the freedom of individuals to do as they please with economic assets, including unlimited carbon emissions and speculative investment. And 5, Earth cannot sustain a poorly unregulated market, a poorly regulated market in which corporations have a mandate to maximize profit, the legal right and resources to achieve size larger than nations, no accountability to bodies politic, be they cities, states, nations, and the right to privatize, own, and sell goods long considered public. Earth cannot sustain a poorly regulated market in which corporations have those rights. Earth can no longer provide or support these requirements of fossil-fueled, corporate and finance-driven global capitalism. Hence, carrying on indefinitely with it is not an option. The option is something different. While we have no choice in whether or not economic life will change, we have tremendous choice about the nature of that change. Around the world, people are asserting with passion and courage that economic policies and practices and structures must serve the widespread good rather than just the interests of a wealthy few. Seeing what could be, the second lens of moral vision, means becoming ever more aware of and engaged with groups and movements working to unsettle and dismantle systems that prioritize profit for a few over the well-being of the many and the well-being of Earth's ecosystems. What of the third form of vision? It is the lens of beauty and gratitude. I am convinced that beauty is there, that beauty exists to breathe life into our weary hearts. The beauty of the Cascadian sky in its grays and cloudy splendor, the sensuous, pure beauty of breeze touching skin, of birdsong at dawn, the beauty of a genuine smile and the embrace of a friend, the delight of a laugh or of true companionship in sorrow, the scent of a fir tree, the gloriousness of a back rub. We are wise to see and drink in, to relish and give thanks for beauty as the breath, or in Hebrew, the ruach of the holy, inspiring life and hope and moral spiritual power within us and among us. We move to the final lens in this fourfold moral vision. It is the lens of seeing the power and presence of the sacred, that great mystery that Jews and Christians and Muslims call God, or that my friend Rabbi Michael Lerner calls the transformative power of the universe. To see this flowing and pouring through all things. Theologian Sally McFay, in her wisdom, spoke of, I quote, our hope against hope, that our efforts on behalf of our planet are not ours alone, but that the source and power of life in the universe is working in and through us for the well-being of all creation, including our tiny part of it, end quote. Here we move to the wisdom of religious and spiritual traditions. Why is the secular world, including large bodies of the world's top scientists, calling on religion to address the climate crisis? Why are they calling on religion? This question invites us to part 3 of my comments. The role of religious wisdom. Where something great is required of humankind, something great is required of its religious traditions. A basic role of religion in the early 21st century is to plumb the depths of our traditions for moral, spiritual power to resist structural evil and to rebuild sustainable earth-human relations marked by social equity. Why religion? Well, different theorists respond differently. The renowned literary figure Amitav Ghosh, who is not a religious person, argues in his book, The Great Derangement, he argues that religion will be key in addressing climate change, if we manage to do so, because religions have existing communities and networks able to mobilize large numbers of people and transcend the self-interest of nation states and of corporate powers. Others argue that religions are a force that call people away from what Luther called selves curved in on self, and rather to lead us outward to serve something beyond self and tribe and nation. The philosopher Roger Gottlieb asserts that religion has the necessary language and conceptual frames to allow for profound grief, communal lament, and the acknowledgement of structural sin and hope. I would argue that every great faith tradition offers a horizon of hope, a set of beliefs and practices that awaken endurance, courage, and infinite hope. But if religion is to meet the challenge of structural evil in this time, it cannot do so in the vestiges of what it has been. No, religion will be in what Larry Rasmussen calls a new key. What will religion for ecological and equitable human life on Earth look like? I'd like you to consider just 7 features of religion that will be capable of building hope and moral spiritual power in these times. The first feature is that religion will be deeply self-critical and reconstructive, acknowledging, for example, where religious beliefs and practices have fueled white supremacy and fueled ecological degradation. 2, religion will be in dialogue with other sources of wisdom, such as the sciences and the arts and the social sciences. Dialogue that this very center cultivates intentionally. 3rd, religion will be interreligious. Again, kudos to this center and its programs. 4th, religion will deprivatize love, compassion, and sin, understanding that these categories pertain not only to individual life, but to the social structures of which we are a part. Societal sin, for example, and neighbor love as an economic, ecological, political calling, not only an interpersonal calling. 5th, religion will replace its anthropocentric claims and assumptions with ecocentric orientations to life. 6th, religion will cultivate truth-telling. And 7th, religion will equip people to hold searing paradox. In particular, the paradox of holding both hope and despair. That's important. Despair need not wipe out hope. And the paradox of profound joy and equally profound sorrow. That we sorrow deeply need not mean that we not have joy also. And the paradox of anger as a companion of love and tutored by love. Religion will equip people to hold these searing paradox and to not let despair wipe out hope, sorrow wipe out joy, or anger be dissociated from love. Well, these then are 7 features of religion. If it is to meet the epic moral spiritual challenge of structural evil at this time in history. So to close, our moment in time is breathtaking. The next few years are probably the most important in history. The adults and youth alive today will determine whether life continues on this planet in ways recognizably verdant and human. So we have in these few minutes, first, described the reality of structural evil intertwined in our lives and so easily hidden in the guise of good or inevitability. In part 2, we proposed 4-fold moral vision, seeing what is going on, especially structural evil parading as good, seeing what could be, seeing the life-giving beauty that pervades our every breath, and seeing the presence of the sacred flowing through all things, luring us toward what could be. And finally, in a brief part 3, we delved into this last form of vision by exploring the vital role of religious wisdom in helping humankind to change direction. May the people of academic and religious wisdom traditions, including each of us here gathered, may we bring our gifts to the great moral spiritual challenge of the 21st century, to forge ways of being human that this glorious planet can sustain and that cultivate profound equity and compassion within the human community. May we be, in the words of Indigenous scholar Winona LaDuke, may we be the ancestors our descendants would be proud of. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cynthia, for those inspiring words. I'd also like to thank the CSRS for inviting me to participate in a conversation with you tonight. It was a pleasure to reread your book. I'd also like to thank the diocese for inviting us and sponsoring this event, and for Bishop Anna for her wonderful words of welcome. What Cynthia and I have agreed to do in this section is I've developed two questions that I will ask her. So I'll ask the question, and then I will say a few words about why it's important or give some context for it. And then Cynthia will respond, and I may respond to her response, and we'll just see where this conversation goes. So, or if it goes, actually. So let's just hope. We agreed to spend some time talking about teaching structural evil in the classroom, in the community, and in the churches, and to teach it in ways that inspire and promote moral agency, that is, action rooted in hope. As Paul mentioned, I teach at St. Jerome's University in the University of Waterloo, where I teach a first-year course called Evil. I also have edited for a number of years a small journal founded by Gregory Baum in 1962 called The Ecumenist, now called Critical Theology. And in that journal, I've wrestled with these issues of faith and structural evil. In the Evil course, I address evil in terms of the integration of the sociological imagination into the ethical responses of various religious communities to the unique forms of structural evil in the modern world. Among these communities, and I deal with Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, this integration has inspired exciting innovation in thinking, practices, forms of community, and institutions. So while analyzing structural evil is present in many traditions, it is always a minority tradition. But even as a minority tradition, it is not insignificant. For example, in Cynthia's book, Resisting Structural Evil makes three main points. One, that evil needs to be understood in its social and structural dimension. Two, that the crisis in economic justice and the ecological crisis are two sides of a single coin. And three, that we need to adopt love rather than say justice as the foundation of a social ethic of justice, solidarity, and ecological redemption. Now, Pope Francis, hardly a marginal figure, makes the first of these 3 points in his 2013 apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium, the second in his 2015 encyclical letter, Laudate Si, and the third in his most recent encyclical, Tutti Fratelli. So it is I would say, a minority perspective, but not an insignificant one. So the first question is whether to students, recognizing its minority status, whether to students or members of the churches or members of society, how do we teach structural evil in ways that concretely cultivate moral agency and inspire people to real action? When I address this in my classes, I use the metaphor of modern society as a great ship moving with increasing speed westward. A certain portion of the passengers and workers on this ship understand that they are moving towards disaster, that west is the wrong direction. And so they organize themselves and they start to march east. And they feel very good because comparing themselves to other passengers, they're moving east while other people are moving in error westward. But from the perspective that Cynthia is proposing and that many others have adopted before her, we understand that even these people marching east are moving west. And that's how we are very often. We feel, I mean, I don't know about you, but my parents had no green consciousness whatsoever. I recycle, reduce, reuse. I feel very good about myself, and I'm very superior to other people who don't, I feel. But in fact, I live in a society in which consumption has gone up, and I consume more of the world's resources than my parents ever imagined. So to affect change, we need to understand religious responses to evil in the modern world needed to be guided by this structural analysis that we find in your book. An analysis of the ship's structure, its direction, velocity, and purpose, which you provide. We also need, and I found this to be one of the very exciting parts of your book, an analysis of the different levels of power and moral responsibility. It no longer is useful to say that we have created an ecological crisis. A system has created an ecological crisis, and we participate at different levels in that system. In this ship analogy, if I may, there are workers in the engine room, cleaners, cooks, managers, as well as people in first class, second class, third and fourth, and people in the bridge, never mind the ship's owners and financiers. Not all have the same power and the same moral responsibility in changing the ship's course. So I use that analogy to raise these challenges that I want to put to you, because I have that privilege here tonight to put them to you rather than to deal with myself. Is how do we shift people's perception from the intensely personal focus we have? Gregory, his 1975 book, which was republished in 2006, Religion and Alienation, talks about how Christianity and the West has tended to see sin and evil in highly individualistic terms. How do we move them to understand the social perspective? Secondly, when people move to this larger social perspective, I find they're much more comfortable with cultural analyses. They might see how they've been influenced by racism or sexism, but they're much less informed about their place in a social structure. My students don't know what capital is. They don't know what corporations are. They have very little education about the fundamental structures of our society. So one of them is that all modern societies on this great ship move towards the maximization of production. And that is tied to the structure of colonialism. If you don't maximize production, you are going to be in a situation of disadvantage in comparison to a society that does. And so how do we get people to think about evil, not just in cultural terms, but in these deeper structural terms? And this I found it was an interesting difference between your perspective and mine, which is I tend to focus on this great kind of structural question. I love these industrialization, democratization, proletarianization. Anything with an ization in it just gives me a thrill, or an ism. It's these kind of impersonal structural processes that are common to all societies that we want to call modern. So how do we get students to understand that? And how do we get them to understand their place on the ship? That even if, for example, they may feel that the settler colonial project in Canada and the United States was wrong, they're on that ship and they're benefiting from that program. Even if they feel that the ecological crisis demands a change in action, they're on the ship moving west. That it's our consumption fuels poverty. And I find actually, it's very often to drive this point home to the most progressive students, to the students who are marching east with the greatest enthusiasm and vigor and commitment. And so those are the type of challenges that I find in talking about and teaching about structural evil, and moving students from this kind of highly individualistic to a more social question, from moving them from the cultural to the structural, and to show their place on the ship and how the ship has shaped them.
Well, David, your questions are, that whole palette of questions is so utterly vital. It's at the heart of what we're doing. And enabling students to see from a structural perspective and to see our role, that we're moral agents, not just as individuals, but as parts of social structures, is crucial. To me, it's crucial to seminary education. So, and it raises up that paradox that I noted before. And I just have to start with that. And that is that it is real that the more students begin to get it, the complexity and the interwovenness of systems, especially economic systems, as you noted, in our lives, the more students get that, the easier it is to feel powerless. So that's a tremendous paradox that we need to get it to begin to dismantle it, and we can't, but getting it can lead to feeling hopeless in the midst of it. That's what happened to me as a 14-year-old. So the first part of that is, how do we enable people to see ourselves as parts of social structures and as moral agents in those? And the second part is how to do that and instill hope. And I think that there are some tools that I have found for helping people to recognize that we are not primarily individuals, but we're primarily parts of systems. And some of the tools I use for that are really starting with, noting that modernity taught us that we are autonomous individuals. That's a presupposition of modernity, and that it is not true that we are primarily autonomous individuals. And the way I began to get at that is by talking about our bodies. That our bodies, only 13% of our bodies are human DNA. Most of the DNA in our bodies is other critters, other microbial beings, and we're not autonomous individuals because of our ancestors, that we're dependent, utterly dependent, in every moment on others, but then also parts of social systems. And one way that I have found to be useful in that is really having students do projects of tracing the relationship between themselves and, say, workers in Africa, by tracing the life of the social and ecological implications of a particular product or activity. So a Bic pen. What's the social, not necessarily Bic, I'm not trying to get on the Bic company, but any item, and then you begin to see, so we began to see all of the connections and all of in most products or most investments, many things, the fallout through systems is tremendously important. So having people see their impact on other people is not primarily through individual actions, but through systems. And then to trace those and give presentations in class, tracing them to see those implications. Excuse me, just 1 minute here. I actually ask people to reimagine themselves a different anthropology, a different moral anthropology that is not a moral anthropology of individuals, and I could go into that. When people start to see that, for instance, every moment of my life, because of systems, is wound up in petroleum. So this pen is composed of petroleum, this computer is composed of petroleum, my house was built by trucks that came by, everything is composed of, people get overwhelmed, astounded, like trapped. And then to me, it's really hopeful. It's really helpful to build on certain I've developed some guidelines for myself, and one is to build on that power of fourfold moral vision, have people start engaging with and in getting to know the movements towards structural change, not just individual change, but structural change. And secondly, really beginning to teach to the unconscious mind, not just the conscious mind. George Lakoff, the cognitive linguist at UC Berkeley, said that something like 93% of human cognition is not conscious, but it's unconscious. And yet we in the academy tend to teach conscious ideas. And so I have found that in terms of building moral power, it's really important to remember the unconscious. And that means including giving space for emotions. So as people are reading about their engagement in structural evil, ask them to sit and be with their emotions and name their emotions and journal or draw or whatever their emotions. And also to be present, especially to emotions like despair and powerlessness, and name them and not run away from them. Because I do believe that the fear, the anger, the horror, the shame and the blame that we can feel is utterly disempowering. And the step towards undoing that is naming it.
I find, I mentioned Gregory Baum, and he did talk about responses to social evil, and sometimes that people are overwhelmed with these emotions. And he said, you know, I mean, really a lot of this guilt is appropriate to individual sin. I mean, we do something, we recognize it as wrong, and we feel guilty, and that's healthy. But in terms of these larger kind of structural trends, guilt is inappropriate. It's not a helpful emotion at all. But on the other hand, you have a denial of guilt. Very often, you'll hear immigrants, like my parents, who come to Canada and say, well, the Indigenous people, we didn't do anything to them. We were in Slovenia, we were not here, we didn't build the residential schools, we didn't clear the land, et cetera, et cetera. But as Gregory says, when you come to a new society, you get onto a moving train. And already you are benefiting from colonization. So personal guilt is inappropriate, but a sense of lamentation, which is part of a Christian and Jewish tradition of lamenting and mourning a society which is built on dispossession and colonization, which is built on ecological destruction, which is built on economic inequality and exploitation. That lamentation would be a more appropriate emotional response. That in fact, emotional responses, perhaps it's because he was German and grew up in a certain time, are counterproductive. That in fact, what you need is that the proper response is commitment and social responsibility. And he had a lovely line in which he says, in which the peace that passeth all understanding becomes a moral relentlessness, a restlessness, that one always wants to move forward towards peace, justice, and solidarity.
Well, I really, I don't know about, I think guilt, I don't think guilt is necessarily a negative emotion. I think shame is. Shame where one feels like one's self, one's being is bad. I don't know if guilt is necessarily so dangerous, but the main thing I want to say in response to what you said is that lament is a powerful gift. And it seems as though we have also privatized lament, but one of the richnesses of the Jewish heritage of Christianity is the call to communal lament. There's an incredible sermon in a book by woman aestheticist Emily Towns in her book about the fine rain of death. And she says that in the book of Joel, in the Hebrew scriptures, society, after terrible chaos and falling apart, people came together only through socially communal lament and calling out to God. So it does seem to me that that is one of the things, lament and repentance. And repentance, communal repentance is a powerful thing. And here's another gift of theology, that repentant, we claim that in the Hebrew teshuvah, in the Greek metanoia, the words repentance mean turning the other direction, not just feeling guilty, but turning the other direction. So building on the power of lament and repentance, I think are very real. And I also have learned, partly in speaking and partly in teaching, that understanding of who we are is really significant in moral power. And I have for some years been teaching that we are three things at one time. And this I get from Luther. I'm in the Lutheran tradition. I'm critically situated in the Lutheran tradition, but there I am. One is we are beloved. And to me, that's profoundly important. So regardless of our enormous complicity in structural evil, we are beloved, and ever will be, regardless, and that is an astounding statement in a society where people feel not good enough and always needing to prove. But so I can admit my role in structural evil if I do know that we are beloved. But secondly, we are indeed broken by sin, a structural sin. Don't even think about the personal sin right now. Just think about that it is part of our lives. So we in a way, one names that. But third, the paradox is, though we are broken by sin, the theological claim is we are body of God's love on earth, and God's love is not a sweet and kindness bit. God's love is justice seeking, for one thing. So the fact that communally human beings, and I would argue all of creation, is body of the only force that truly can heal creation, the creative, redeeming mystery that imbues all, that is life-changing. To claim that we are beloved, we are broken by sin, and we are body of this astounding justice-seeking, earth-relishing love is an interesting, or actually I would say a morally empowering way of understanding who I am. So that's part of my understanding in relationship to what you said.
If we don't move we could be here all night. This is wonderful. I love listening to you. But I have a second question.
Yeah.
And that is, given that climate change seems to be unfolding, as you said, even more rapidly than scientists predicted, how do we develop an ethic of urgency? In the churches and religious communities, how do we develop a spirituality of urgency? And how do we do it without giving people a sense that the stakes are so large and the problem so pressing that we actually discourage and disempower them?
Yeah.
So let me just say a couple of words about why I asked that question. I think that structural cultural analysis reveals the interconnection amongst these various crises. So it lifts up the complexity. I mean, you cannot solve the ecological crisis until you solve colonialism, until you solve imperialism. You can't ask China to reject the maximization of production in the short run, since China has had the experience of the 19th century and the 20th century, and they understand that unless you modernize, unless you produce and overproduce, you will fall behind. You will be colonized by others who don't take those precautions, right? So or take those measures. So they understand the game very well. So it just shows you, I mean, and then you bring into your wonderful book the impact of racism and sexism and other forms of systemic evil and how they're all interconnected. So you have this question of complexity. And now we have the question of urgency. And I told Cynthia that I would quote from Martin Luther King's a letter from Birmingham jail, written in response to religious leaders who protested his extremism, who wanted him to take a slower path towards towards civil liberties. And he said, "I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride towards freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, 'I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action,' who paternalistically believes that he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by the mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a, quote, more convenient season, unquote." And then he goes on to say that now is the time to take a stand. And it's that phrase, "now is the time," that calls us to action. I mean, are we the white moderates of the ecological crisis? And if so, how do we join the fight?
I think the last part of your question depends upon who the we is. And when you say, are we the white moderates of? And that begs the question of who the we is.
I meant specifically the people listening to this lecture.
Yeah, got it.
I imagine people who come to a lecture like this already feel that the ecological crisis is real, the economic injustice is real, and that we have to address them. How do we move to real action? Yeah,
one of the things, and that also is the burningly important question. The way I frame that question is, we're living in a house. Imagine that we're living in that we're in a long house, and it's on fire at the other end, and our neighbors are in it and they're burning, and the fire is coming right towards us. And we're sitting there doing nothing to put out the fire, but rather putting fuel on it. So are we the white moderates? In many senses, yes. And we have potential to be powerfully transformative, engaged agents. And one of the things that ignites that potential, in my experience, is really listening to the stories from the front lines. And by that, I mean not only this, I mean the stories of people, the lives of people now being displaced and disrupted and devastated, and that also are acting with moral power. There's something, I spent years bringing delegations of people to Latin America, to Central America during the war years. And nothing was more empowering than meeting people who were impoverished people who were being brutalized by systems of power and were resisting and struggling and fighting. And that's the same in the climate situation. Meeting people who are both impacted and struggling forward with agency is tremendously moving. And I also think that we build on the power of practice. In other words, practicing powerlessness reinforces it, but practicing action reinforces a sense of agency. So one of the things that I do with my students is in groups, never alone, in groups, they do an interrupting injustice project. And they need to do something to interrupt one form of systemic injustice. And then they need to analyze how that interruption can have impacts on the worldview level, on the behavioral level, and the structural level. And then they analyze how the pieces work together, but they've got to do as a group this action. And it's got to be risky, and it's got to be challenging a form of privilege in which they're on the upper side. And almost invariably, students come out of that project feeling a bigger, both understanding the urgency to act and feeling a bigger capacity to act. So it was a student once who taught me to understand that practicing powerlessness creates increased powerlessness, but practicing engagement creates power. So I think that's part of, to me, that's part of teaching urgency, but in a way, those two things, the power of story and the power of practice, are both keys to me.
I think Paul has indicated that it's actually time to open up the questions to our audience. This has been such a great engagement. I could go on forever, but I'm sure—
David, it would be so much fun to talk with you for a long, long time, a long, long time. Yeah.
We hope you have a chance at some point to come up over the border and hang out with us up here at the center. Thanks very much for this conversation between the two of you. I think it has actually really stirred the pot in a really productive way. So there are two things that can happen now. We can have questions from the group here in the room, but there's also questions that may come up on Zoom, and my colleague Rachel Brown is here to help direct those questions to me and sift through them. Do we have a question either from Zoom or from the room? Martin, could you we have a microphone. Perfect.
Yeah, thanks for this incredible encounter between these between the two of you. I'm really glad, Cynthia, you ended on the last point about the exercise you do with your student of interrupting injustice. Actually, you anticipated my question, because I was going to ask, what is the role of the academic in encouraging direct action? In the past, universities have always held back from involvement in political, as teachers, we've always felt it's our role to present two sides and not to actually encourage political action one way or another, or at least not directly. Has that changed?
That's an excellent question. I'm not sure who asked it. Are you someone involved in university education?
Yeah, he's a professor of Buddhist philosophy here at...
Got it. Okay, thanks. Yes, the role of academics in encouraging direct action. It's a beautiful question. And I would say that higher education is changing, and it is changing dramatically. And I'm including in that seminary education, graduate education in theology. We are seeing, where I teach, we're seeing the importance of equipping people for action. And that, in my context, that is very explicit. In other words, we require all of our master's students to take a course in community organizing. It's faith-based community organizing for social transformation. We require them to take a course in faith-based social transformation that tries to get at the nexus of race, class, earth, and race, class, gender, and earth. So I think that there's a lot of complexity and controversy over teaching action. It is not the same as teaching people to believe in a certain way. To me, it's tremendously important to teach critical thinking and skills of theorizing in relationship to action. The power of theory to dissect what's going on, including what's going on to create moral inertia, is vitally important. So the idea of praxis as theory and action informing and interweaving with each other, I think is tremendously important now in higher education, including theological education, to equip people for, and many universities have rhetoric of equipping people for compassionate citizenship and seeking justice in society, et cetera. That includes, we get so many people who want to change the world and have no idea how to go about the long-term work of structural change. And so helping people gain those skills is part of the beauty, the profound beauty of education, it seems to me. I hope that responds a little bit.
Yeah, thank you very much. Any other questions? Peter? Oh, I thought you were heading to the microphone. Rach?
Sure. Hi, Cynthia. I'm just going to ask some questions from the Zoom room. And so a couple long ones here, so I'll try to get to the point if I can. So Janet Gray is wondering, she's asking about concepts of sacrifice zones. So things like referring to mining in Chile and Peru and Quebec, places that bring lithium to create solar and electric car batteries, those sorts of things. How do we respond to that? So how can people of faith truly grapple with human rights and ecocide and not just replace fossil fuels with equally potentially damaging mining or not so clean green alternatives? So
yeah, beautiful. That's a very important question. It's a very important question. I've been teaching that there are 3 layers to the catastrophe of climate injustice, and one is that it's being generated, it's being suffered not by the people who are generating it, and 2 is that we can produce alternatives that to protect ourselves, powerful or climate privileged people, and leave others to drown and die. But the 3rd is the one you raise, and that is our solutions to climate change can endanger and damage the people already the most vulnerable. And this was argued very importantly by a group of Indian scientists. And you've given a couple of examples of that, the sacrifice zones. And there are many other examples, you know, biofuels that take up croplands to produce fuel. So my response to that is that the first step is exposing, seeing. I mean, it's the lens of what is. Exposing those sacrifice zones. So exposing the dangers in mining certain things, mining certain elements that then destroy the lands and the people who live on the mined areas in order to build alternative energies. So exposing that is step 1. But step 2 is bringing a racial equity lens and an economic equity lens to all solutions or steps to address climate change. So whenever something is proposed, or whenever something is being looked at, it's got to be looked at not just for its carbon footprint, but for its racial equity and economic equity footprint. And that bears amazing results. And to me, that lens is crucial for addressing that matter of sacrifice zones.
Can I jump in just for a very quick second? In my course, I go to the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, introduced this idea of the end of the innocent critique. And innocent critique is, they're the bad guys, we're the good guys, let's have the revolution in this direction. And it's always been that case, right? I mean, you had medieval society, the capitalists, the liberals said, the problem is a lack of freedom, we're the good guys, they're the bad guys. Then the socialists came along, said, they're the bad guys, we're the good guys. And on it went. And what they concluded was that we need to drop this structure of our critique, which is they're the bad guys, we're the good guys, and look at what is good in the system that we're criticizing and what is wrong in our own system. And so there's this kind of idea, religious thinkers have picked this up and said, yes, this is kind of like an idea that only God is good, only God has a perfect system, all human systems are, as you mentioned in your lecture, made by human beings, therefore they're all going to be flawed. And so you actually have to commit yourselves to a kind of eternal critique. Jesus comes and settles everything. Or however the world ends according to your religion.
No, I think that's vitally important. To me, it's the intermingling of good and evil. Yeah, and it's very much an offering of theology to hold that up. Yeah.
So Cynthia, I wonder your reflections when you're reflecting on the resources that you have in your own Lutheran tradition to respond to the crisis that you're seeing around you. You turn to language that's richly, embedded in the Bible and Luther and so forth. But what about, since you're familiar, obviously, with the Cascadia context, what about the vast majority of folks, especially under 40, for whom that language would be very, well, sort of inert? It doesn't really speak to them. So how do, as it were, insiders, theologians, who are steeped in this language, and for whom that language is profoundly motivating, and also encompassing, I think, and does kind of provide a critique and a response and a way out. How do folks like you think about the kind of Cascadian majority, especially those under 40, for whom these concerns are existential? How do you communicate with them when the language, there's not much receptivity for that language for some folks? Certainly in our class, since we're speaking about teaching, I think the question of the receptivity to the language is an important concern. One thing I wonder about, if you could address, is whether or not there might be a way in which the relationship to nature that is so much a part of the Cascadian sensibility might offer another spiritual orientation, which is not called spiritual, but some kind of form of naturalism, which might speak to this.
Yeah, those are really important points. And I'm from the Pacific Northwest. That's my home. And now here I am in the Bay Area of California, which is another none zone. In other words, religion is maybe almost as, there's as much disdain for religion here as there is in the Pacific Northwest. But I think it's very easy to talk theological claims without theological language. That's one thing, and I'll come back to an example of that in a moment if there's time. But I think your other point about the building on the kind of reverence for and spiritual connectedness to the earth in Cascadia is a very powerful and important pathway. And it's a pathway that I believe in very, very deeply. Part of what I do in teaching is have people, I call it, one of my principles is for a pedagogical principle is build on the power of the earth. And so just asking people to spend time hearing or being with something other than human of the earth can be really important. So they do an earth.
Hang on one second, Cynthia. Our screen just went away. So David and I can see you, but our friends can't. So I think
we can't
hear her either. How exciting.
I think, yes, the powers that be got tired of your exposing
radical American theologians.
I see.
So the worst. Yeah.
I wonder if I could take an opportunity to address Paul's question, and that is that, I mean, you do have this wonderful theological heritage. I mean, this body of people speaking about structural justice from a theological standpoint, and an increasing number of students who have absolutely no interest in religion. It's not that they're hostile to religion; they've never experienced it. Sometimes I feel I may as well be teaching, ironsmithing. But I do find that even at a university that is technologically driven, we kind of think of ourselves at the University of Waterloo as the MIT or Stanford of Canada. Even in an environment like that, students open themselves to this discourse. I mean, as long as you teach in a pluralistic stance in manner, you don't care about their faith. I tell my students, I don't care about you. I love you, but I don't care about you. I don't care if you're Christian, Buddhist, or whatever. But that there's got to be increasing ways of talking across the religious secular divide. And I really think moving forward, the climate change crisis is, I think, the most important context for this. But the religious secular divide is becoming irrelevant. It's now people who are willing to face structural evil and people who want to continue participating in it, the perpetrators and the white moderates who are willing to allow this ship to continue moving west at increasing speeds. That's the real division. And I find when you speak respectfully and cautiously to secular students and you don't demand a faith response back, that they get it. No one, I sometimes say my evil course isn't so much a course as an extended sermon. And I've never had a single complaint from the students that this is too, you know, that I'm pushing too many theological, spiritual, and ethical buttons. Now you're back online.
You're back online. You're back on the screen. We have just about a minute left before we have to wrap up. But please offer your reflections on David's.
Yeah, and on the question that you raised, Paul, I guess I would say my understanding is that all fields of human wisdom have gifts to offer today to the dramatic challenge before us. And religion does have gifts to offer. It has to offer them in ways that aren't necessarily religious discourse, but maybe religious discourse. But religions, all of them, need to plumb their depths for what we can bring to the table, just like every field of science, every field of human inquiry and art and everything need to plumb their depths. So religions better figure out what they're going to bring to the table. Now, in a place like Cascadia, what I learned in teaching undergrads is that if I taught religions about religion, as you did, saying it doesn't matter what you are, but if I began with critique by acknowledging that, especially Christianity has been a source of tremendous damage structurally in the world, that opens eyes, because people think that you're there to defend religion. Well, I'm there partly to critique religion. And the other thing that has become ever more real to me is the claim, the theological claim, the ancient theological claim that the sacred lives within the created world. That I've had people really take a second look at religion just from that claim. Like I now go and pray to God in the trees, specific trees. I pray to God in the trees. And there is something about the mystery, the sacred mystery living within the created world that can, I think, have resonance with people who don't necessarily want to see the sacred mystery living in a church, but that it might make difference to see it as flowing through the rivers and the ocean. So those are some of the things that strike me about the role of religious wisdoms in highly unreligious contexts. There's so much more to say, but I know that it's time to close.
I think we'll have a chance in the future, or I hope we'll have a chance in the future to have a way to engage with you again. Certainly tomorrow at the center, we'll be talking with you. So I want to, first of all, thank Cynthia and David for their presentations and their conversation. I want to thank you. Let's join you.
Thank you. And thank you to the audience for bearing with a Zoom conversation, even with screens going up and down.
Yeah. Thanks very much to Brendan and Anna for participating in this I don't know, it's almost been 2 decades that we've had this series going, and it's brought all kinds of really wonderful people to town. So thanks very much for that. Thanks so much to my staff and my friends, Scott, Noriko, and Rachel. As you've seen, this is just one small example. When the screen's going up, there's one small example of hiccups, both technical, geological, geographical, that we have to deal with at all times at the center. And this week has been no different, and Scott especially has been tremendously clever in the way he solved all.
Absolutely, yeah.
Thanks very much to Scott.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thanks to Jordan for making things work and then rework, and much appreciated. Thanks everybody, stay at home and see you later. And the next lecture is, oh, I don't control the slides apparently. The next lecture is not until the new year, and this gives you some sense of the next 2. We're just looking for the right button to push. That is there. Oh, I can see it. There we go. Okay, so the first lecture of the New Year's series is going to be Andrew Wender talking about Messianic imperialism, the nature of a paradox. And the next lecture in the series of John Albert Hall lectures, which is the special collaboration between the Anglican Diocese and the CSRS, will be March 3rd. So that's one of these more, some longer format conversations. And that's Watershed Moments, Spirituality, Forest, and Fresh Water, featuring, among other people, Sephora Berman. So please join us for that. And look forward to seeing you next year, as it were. Okay, bye everyone.